But if you are like me, and I know that you are, because this is something I know about you and I know it about me too, is that you've made mistakes in your past that you're not real proud of. Right? I mean, this is true of all of us. Maybe it was that thing that you did on spring break that one year and your parents told you not to go and you went anyway and you did that thing and it's been kind of following you ever since. Or maybe it was that thing that you did that one time on that one business trip to Vegas and they told you what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and that's been kind of following you around ever since. Maybe it was a season of your life where you were kind of locked into a series of bad habits, and you just kind of look back at that time in your life and you just kind of shudder, and you're like, oh, wow, I wish I could redo that whole part of my life because I don't feel real good about that. Or maybe for as long as you can remember, you've been kind of in some habits that are less than healthy and they're destructive, and maybe that's a hidden thing, and people around you don't really know that that's a habit of yours, but you carry the shame and the resentment around all the same. Or maybe it's something that's public and everybody knows, and it's just something that you're dealing with and working through. But I've talked to enough people to realize that this is a universal issue, that all of us have things in our past and in our present that we do or have done that we're not real proud of, that we feel a sense of shame or guilt or resentment over, regret. And for many of us, that sense of regret and shame affects how we view God, and more importantly, it affects how we think God views us. You know, many of us believe that God really doesn't want anything to do with us anymore because of that thing that we did or that season of our life. You know, He told me not to do that with them, and I did it anyway. And so God just kind of turned His back on me and kind of gave up me at that point, and I've been walking by myself ever since. Or that whole season of my life, God was really showing patience with me, and He was waiting for me to kind of get my act straight, but it took too long, and God kind of left me during that time, and He hasn't been back ever since, and I've been on my own, and we feel ashamed, and so we're convinced that God has just, turned our back. We feel regret, and so we think God is disappointed in us, or God is angry with us. And so why go to church? Why pray? Why try to have a relationship with Him? Not now. I've blown it too many times. I lost my chance. I could certainly relate to these feelings and emotions of regret and how we can often make it think that God views us in a particular way because of them. I have done things in my past that I am so regretful of and shameful of. Things I haven't even been able to tell my kids. Things I still shudder of, when I think about the fact that I did them. Just a few weeks ago, my youngest son, Logan, he's 16, and we were up in a part of town in Denver, and we had some time to kill. So I'm like, hey, would you like to see the house where I lived when I was in 5th grade? And he's like, sure. And I don't know if you've done this recently or ever done this, but you kind of drive by one of your old childhood houses, and all the memories kind of come flooding back, and you remember all these things. And sure enough, I found the house, and we drove by, and I remembered all these things. I remembered, is it right there where I got into my first fight? Well, more accurately, it was right there that I got beat up for the first time. Oh, I remember that in the 5th grade. I remember this time because I lived right across the street from my elementary school. Dow Elementary was right across the street. And I remember this one time I skipped school and I was hiding out at my house. And the principal actually came over to my door and he's knocking on the door. And I'm like hiding inside. And I was sure that he was just going to barge through the door and grab me by the scruff of the neck and put me back over in my desk. It was a terrifying moment. But we're driving through the neighborhood and these memories are kind of coming back to me. We got about 2 blocks away from my house. I'm still seeing things that are familiar. Things are still coming back to me. And then I saw this church. And you've probably done this too, where you say something and the words are coming out of your mouth and you wish you could just kind of take those words back and not say them. And that's what happened to me in that moment. I saw this church and I said, oh, that's the church I robbed. And did I say that? And Logan just jumped right on it. You did what, Dad? What did you do? And I was like, did I actually say that out loud? Can I just take those words back? And I felt this incredible sense of shame come over me, but it was true. When I was in the 5th grade, there was this church, and I forget whether I was alone or all by myself, but I went up to the church and I broke a window and I broke into the church and found one of their supply rooms and stole some softball equipment. I couldn't believe I'd done something like that. How can anybody rob a church? What kind of person robs a church? And more than that, how could a kid who robbed a church and did many more shameful things, much more shameful things in his later years, how could a kid like that go on to one day become a pastor? Someone who would claim to love God and love people and serve God and serve people and lead other people to do the same. While your mistakes may not be the same as my mistakes, as a matter of fact, my list of mistakes may make you feel better about your list of mistakes, we could all relate to the feelings of shame and regret that come from the sins of our past and our present. And we're in the summer series called Finding Grace in Unexpected Places. And we're looking at stories of grace in the Old Testament because that's a place a lot of us don't expect to find grace. A lot of us, when we think about the Old Testament, we think about rigidity and violence and sternness and law. And we think about wrath and retribution. We don't think about grace. Not when we think about the Old Testament, but it's in there. It's all the way through there. And we've been defining grace as getting something good that I don't deserve, something that I've actively disqualified myself from. And we see God giving grace all through the Old Testament, giving people what they don't deserve, what they've actively disqualified themselves from. And we see it in the very first story of Adam and Eve. And that's where we started, and we saw that they should have gotten, what they deserved was instant death after they died, but they got grace. They got what they didn't deserve as God provided them a substitution for their sin to die in their place, a kind of looking forward to Jesus, who would be the ultimate substitutionary sacrifice for all of our sins. They kind of got grace as we got grace. We have a substitution for our sins. And we looked last week at Abraham, and we saw how we're saved and how grace says it's not about what I do, it's not about my performance, it's about what God does, it's about what He has done. And all He wants me to do is trust. He wants faith, that I'm saved by grace through faith. He wants more than anything. The thing He values more than anything is that I trust Him to do the work of saving me. And this is grace, and it's in the Old Testament. And today we come to yet another story, and we find grace in an unexpected place. And we're going to see another facet of grace that we haven't covered yet through this famous Old Testament story. This guy was an impetuous, self-reliant, hot-headed murderer. And he finds grace. And his name is Moses. And I love Moses' story. I could identify so much with Moses' story because Moses' story is really two stories. It's the before story and the after story. Moses' story is like the first half, that's kind of a train wreck, and then the second half that becomes redemptive and beautiful in the hands of God. Moses definitely, throughout his life, gets what he doesn't deserve from God. He's born at a time when it's not very safe to be a Hebrew. If you were with us last week, we talked about Abraham and this promise that God had made to Abraham that he was going to become a great nation. He was going to have more kids than he can count. And sure enough, within a couple generations, his descendants are multiplying and he's becoming this big tribe. And through a series of events, a famine leads them from Palestine and Canaan down into Egypt. And there in Egypt, they continue to multiply and they continue to grow bigger and bigger, so much so that the Egyptians start to get intimidated. And they say, if these people continue to grow, they're going to outnumber us. And then if we get into a war, they're going to ally themselves with one of our enemies, and they're going to destroy us. So we need to do something. And that's how they came up with a plan to kind of enslave the descendants of Abraham, the Hebrews. And so by the time Moses has been born, the Hebrews have been in slavery for nearly 400 years. Just think about that. 4 centuries of time this nation had been in slavery, and still they're a growing nation. They're hardy people. They're still just kind of multiplying and getting bigger. And so Pharaoh issues an order, and he says, every male child, kill him. Just put him to death. We got to contain this growth. And that's when Moses is born to Amram and Jochebed. And the law said that he should be thrown into the Nile and drowned. But the Bible says that when his mother saw him and saw that he was a fine child, could also be translated a beautiful child, a special child, that she hid him for 3 months. But after 3 months, she could hide him no longer. And so she comes up with a plan. You can read that in Exodus chapter 2, and there's a basket involved and reeds in the Nile River and Pharaoh's daughter. But through the series of events, Moses isn't only saved from certain death, but he ends up growing up in the palace of Pharaoh, the adoptive son of Pharaoh's daughter. So Moses is going to grow up pretty good. He got all the advantages that came with living in Pharaoh's house. He had the very best education on the planet. He wore the nicest clothes of any of his peers. When he turned 16, he got the coolest chariot that anybody had ever seen before. And more than that, he had a brighter future than anybody in all of Egypt. He had the world before him. He could do anything he wanted to do. But Moses knew who he was. The Bible also tells us that as he was growing up, that his Hebrew mother raised him until the time he was old enough to move into the palace. And during that time, you could just imagine her taking advantage of the time she had with her son before she went to live with Pharaoh, telling him all about Yahweh, the God of their ancestor Abraham, telling him all about the special plan that this God, the God of the Hebrews, had for his life, telling him that he was going to be the deliverer of his people. He was a special child. She saw it from the time he was born. The Spirit impressed her. He was a special child. He would deliver the people. And so I can just imagine Moses growing up with this tension in the palace, yet knowing who he is. Lying awake at night, wondering, what path will I choose? Will I follow the plan that the God of my biological people, the Hebrews, has for me and be their deliverer? Or will I follow the plan of my grandfather, the God of Egypt, the Pharaoh? And will I follow that course of my adoptive family? And we know that through a series of events, Moses ends up, for some reason, choosing, I'm going to identify with my people, the Hebrews. And I can just imagine and beginning to wonder, how will I free them? How will I use my talent, my education, my military training? How will I use my giftedness in order to set my people free? And in Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, if you have a Bible, you may want to find that passage. Moses, we find him there taking action. And he takes matters into his own hands in order to kind of live out his purpose. And let's look at it together. Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse 11, it says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. You wonder how many times Moses did this. How many times would he go out and just kind of watch the taskmasters beating people like his mother and his father and his siblings? And what did that do inside of him? What kind of anger did that create? He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So we can kind of fill in some of the gaps there, and we imagine Moses kind of going out and seeing his people from time to time, kind of checking on them, seeing how they were faring. And again, I imagine the anger he must have felt as he watched these people, like his family members, just being abused and being treated so incredibly harshly, as he watched them suffering unjust beatings and just backbreaking labor. I mean, when did the anger start? When did it start to grow in him? Maybe on this day he said, "You know what? I've had enough. I can't take it anymore." And before he knew it, he is out of his chariot in a blind rage, and the anger overtakes him. But before he knows what he's doing, his hands are around the throat of another human being. And not just another human being, an Egyptian, and an Egyptian leader at that. And he's squeezing the life out of this person. And he realizes what he's done. He's just killed somebody. And what's the next thing that any of us do when we sin and we know we have? He seeks to hide it. He drags the body and he buries it in the sand. You know, we read the story 3,500 years. It could seem so sterile. It could seem like, that's not that big of a deal. I mean, even the Bible sums it up in just a few words. He killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. But if we put ourselves in Moses' place, we could begin to realize how big a deal this really was. I mean, this is in the day when if you were going to kill somebody, you had to do it with your hands. maybe with a knife or just with your bare hands. And so this wasn't a clean, sterile thing. This is messy, and there's struggle involved, and panic, and eyeball to eyeball struggle. It had to be ugly. It wouldn't be pretty. He watched the life drain out of another human being at his hands, and then he, again, drags the body. I've got to hide this. No one can know. And he buries it in the sand. The next day, he returns to the scene of the crime, as many criminals do. Maybe he wants to just hear, does anybody know? Is anybody talking about me? Did I get away with it? Maybe he thought the Hebrews would know. Maybe he thought they would protect him. Maybe he thought they would comfort him. Maybe he even thought they would rally around him and call him the great revolutionary, and he would start a revolution. But he gets back to the scene of the crime, and no such thing, no support from his people, no comfort from his people, but they did know. And he finds mistrust and hostility instead of anything, and word gets back to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh must have felt heartbroken and betrayed by this Hebrew slave whom he had taken into his home and given everything to. How could Moses do this? Not only did he murder one of his countrymen, but he was committing treason against Egypt and against his grandfather, the Pharaoh. He was a traitor. And as a result, Pharaoh issues a decree to kill the traitor Moses. Well, Moses flees for his life, and he finds himself sitting by a well in this God-forsaken desert of Midian. And just, again, we put ourselves in Moses' sandals for just a moment. And he's got to be sitting there wondering, what in the world just happened? I mean, a couple days ago, I'm sitting in the palace. I've got the world in front of me. I could do anything that I want to do. And now because of one stupid mistake, one stupid sin, I find myself exiled from my people, from my family. The Hebrews are no better off, and here I am, sitting by a well in the desert, where I'll probably spend the rest of my life living with the regret of my one stupid mistake. And one of the things we got to realize is every one of us is one stupid mistake away from losing everything. We're one stupid mistake away from losing our reputation, one stupid mistake away from losing our family, one stupid mistake away from losing our job, our career, our business, one stupid mistake away from losing our future. So Moses finds himself in that place. One stupid mistake. Ends up marrying a Midianite woman, the daughter of a shepherd. And so Moses ends up caring for sheep every day, where he is reminded day in and day out of his one stupid mistake, of his sin. And he feels the remorse and he feels the regret. And he's reminded every day of his sin because he's a shepherd. And it's easy to kind of read over that fact and not realize the significance of it, how being a shepherd would remind him every day of how far he has fallen. But we learn at the end of Egypt, as one of the ancestors of Moses, Joseph, is kind of bringing his family from Canaan down into Egypt, and he's kind of coaching them on their first meeting with Pharaoh. And he tells them, I know you guys are all shepherds, but you can't tell Pharaoh you're a shepherd. Tell them you are a keeper of livestock. I don't understand how that's not a shepherd, but okay, tell them you're a keeper of livestock. The Bible says in Genesis 46, because the Egyptians detested shepherds. And Moses is raised as an Egyptian, and he gains these cultural values of an Egyptian, and he hates shepherds. He detests shepherds, and here he is because of his sin. Because of murdering that man, because of taking matters into his own hands, because of being impetuous and hot-headed, here he is with the rest of his life, remembering what he did, doing that one thing that he said he would never do, being a shepherd, from the palace to the shepherd, because of one stupid mistake. And I just imagine him every day beating himself up. What have I done? How far have I fallen? How much regret did he feel? Did he shudder as he thought about what he did? Did he ever think about, have dreams about that guy's life draining out of him? Did he ever wonder about the man's family and the loss that they suffered and what they must have thought? Did he miss his family? But during this time, God's grace is doing a work in Moses. Moses, during this time, is getting what he doesn't deserve. Because rather than abandon Moses, grace keeps God in Moses' life despite his sin. God doesn't give up on Moses just because he blew it, even though Moses' list of sins is probably greater than ours, with murder right at the very top of it. God doesn't turn his back on Moses and go looking for someone else to be the deliverer of Egypt. He stays with Moses and does a work in Moses over the years that he's shepherding in the wilderness. See, God's power is working in Moses' life to transform him from the inside out. And that's one of the aspects of grace. You know, when we think about getting what we don't deserve from God, and we think about grace, often we think about grace just being forgiveness for sin. We think that the role of grace is to forgive me for sin so I can get into heaven when I die. And that's certainly an aspect of grace. Grace forgives us of sin so that we can be saved and go to heaven when we die. But grace is so much more than that. Grace is also God's power in us to transform us, to change us. God's grace is his ability to take our sins, to take our mistakes, to take our shame, to take our brokenness and our weaknesses and do something useful with them. Grace looks at where I've been, looks at where we've been, and meets us right where we are and says, I don't only love you, I'm not only willing to forgive you, I am going to transform you. I'm going to give you power to live a new kind of life. I'm going to take your brokenness and I'm going to make it something beautiful. Just give me what you have and let me get to work. This week I heard a story about a unique artist, I think she's in California, young lady, who has a very unique canvas. She's a painter, but she only paints on old X-ray films of people with brokenness. And so she gets these old X-ray films of broken bones and deformities of people and brain scans that brought bad news. And she'll take these films and she'll study them and she'll look at the brokenness and she'll study it and then she'll start to paint around it. And she takes these X-ray films of brokenness and she creates this work of art. And she says she'll often think about the anxiety the person must have felt looking at this film. Nobody looks at a broken bone or a bad brain scan and thinks beautiful things. But you think, I'm broken. You think, I'm over, I'm done. But she says the greater the brokenness, the more excited she gets and the better she creates a work of art on that X-ray film. And that's so much like what God does with us. He says, give me your brokenness and let me do something with it. Let me create something out of it. Let me make a work of art. You see, God doesn't give up on Moses. He comes to Moses years later and he speaks to him from the burning bush, a story you may be familiar with. And God shocks Moses not only in the fact that he would talk to him, but that he would still call him, that he would still have a purpose for his life. And it says in Exodus chapter 3, verse 10, it goes on to say, go now. God's saying to Moses, go now. I'm sending you. I'm using you. I still have a purpose for you. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So God still has his plan, this purpose for Moses. And Moses is just so shocked. He's so shocked that the first words out of his mouth are, who am I? Who am I that I should lead the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I that you should even know who I am? Do you know what I've done, God? Do you know my list of sins? Do you know the stupid mistakes that I've done to bring me to this place? Do you know about my failure? Do you know about my brokenness? And of course God knows. God knows that he's been haunted by his brokenness every day for 4 decades. But God doesn't use perfect people. God doesn't use perfect people. He uses broken people. He takes the sins and the mistakes of our past and by grace turns them into something he could use. He takes a hot-headed, impetuous murderer like Moses and he transforms him into one of the greatest, most humble spiritual leaders in the history of the world. Unless we think this is just a fluke. Well, of course he did it. That was Moses, right? lest we think that God just made an exception for Moses. No. This is God's pattern. God seems to find some kind of joy in finding people with the biggest issues and the biggest mistakes in their past, the people who are running 100 miles an hour in a wrong direction away from Him, and getting their attention and saying, I've got plans for you. I'm going to use you in some big, amazing way. This is the story of most of the great people in the Bible. The before story, the after story. The let me do things my way story, and I'm going to follow you, God story. This is not only the story of the greatest man and leader of the Old Testament, but it's also the story of the greatest leader in the New Testament. I don't know if you've ever compared the stories of Paul, the apostle, and Moses, the leader of God's people in the Old Testament, but they're nearly identical. I mean, both of them have, two stories in one, the before story and the after story. Both of them have that, first half of their lives that was a train wreck, and the second half of their life that is a glorious work of art in the hands of God. But Paul, in the first half of his story, is known as Saul, and he is a terror to Christians everywhere. I mean, he is this religious zealot who wanted nothing more than to stamp out Christianity, and he thought he was serving God by doing it. So he would go from town to town. He would throw Christ followers into prison. He would have many of them executed and killed. I mean, he was determined to spend every waking moment kind of until this cult was a thing of the past. And you would think that if you or I were writing this story, if this was a made-up story, that this would be the first guy that God stamps out. You're messing with my people. That if God was going to use His power to do anything, He would rub this guy, Saul of Tarsus, out so that his movement can continue to flourish. But no. God looks at Saul, and again, none of us could ever draw this up, but God looks at him and says, I think I could use that guy. I mean, that kind of energy, that kind of passion, if I get him heading in the right direction, he's going to be useful for me. And that's what God does. He gives us what we don't deserve. And so instead of God wiping him out, God gets his attention despite Saul's sins, despite the fact that his life is heading 100 miles an hour in the wrong direction. God gets his attention through a series of events. And Saul realizes, I have been heading the wrong direction. I've been working for the wrong side. I've been killing the wrong people. And he has this realization, and the book of Acts tells us he is distraught. He is overwhelmed. He lays in a bed, doesn't get up for 3 days, doesn't eat anything, doesn't drink anything. He wants to die. As the weight of his sin and the realization of what he has done comes over him, he's like, I'm done. I can't get up. Just let me die here. So God sends Ananias and prays over him and says, God's still got a purpose for you, Paul. Let's get you baptized and let's send you on your way. An amazing story of grace, of a man getting what he didn't deserve, of God taking the brokenness of a person's past and using it for His purpose. I mean, the greatest terror in the Christian church would become the greatest builder of the Christian church. That God would take Paul's weaknesses, that God would take the sins of his past and by grace transform them and use them for something beautiful. Wow. And as Paul continues to wrestle with the sins of his past and present throughout the rest of his life, and he wrestles with his weaknesses, he comes to this place with God where he's wrestling over one particular issue. And in this famous exchange, God just kind of sets the record straight with Paul. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we read about this in verse 9, where God finally says to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. I know you want to be perfect. I know you want to get rid of all your weaknesses, but my grace is enough. It's enough. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I mean, think about that. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Do you get that? I mean, God's grace is His power working in our weakness. Our weakness is an opportunity for God to do what only He can do in our lives. Our weakness makes us rely more on Him. And if we didn't have any, we wouldn't have any need of Him. And our weakness gives God the opportunity to display His power and His grace. And so, what weakness is God working in you now to display His power? I find it amazing that God would take a guy like Paul, who was tearing the church apart like no one else in history. and transform him by grace into a God who would build up the church like no one else in history. That's what God does. That's what grace looks like. He doesn't use perfect people. Otherwise, he wouldn't have anyone to work with, right? He doesn't just give us one shot. Grace doesn't just give us 10 shots. Grace gives us one more shot, regardless of how many shots we have taken and how many we have blown. And he is a specialist in taking hopeless sinners and turning their shameful past into something beautiful that he could use for his purposes and for his glory. This week I was reminded of the story of Chuck Colson, this guy who was at the height of power in the 70s, one of Nixon's cabinet, but through the shame of the Watergate scandal, he's indicted. He goes to prison, from the palace to prison, and there he meets Christ. And God's grace says, I'm going to take the sin of your past, I'm going to turn it into something beautiful for my purposes. And he comes out of there not only as a Christian, but he develops one of the world's greatest prison ministries that we've ever seen. That's grace. God looks at a guy like Chuck Colson and says, I don't only love you, I'm not only going to forgive you, I'm not only going to save you, I'm going to transform you. God would take a kid who robbed the church as a child, a kid who would go on to do many more shameful and regretful things, and transform that kid into a man who just lives to invest in the church and build it up. God's grace didn't just love him. God's grace didn't just forgive him. God's grace is transforming. Right here in Newday is a man who was addicted to pornography. And he lived with a constant shame and guilt that comes with that hidden sin, that hidden addiction. But as he turned to Christ in desperation, God not only forgave him, God not only loved him, God transformed him. God set him free. And more than that, God took the sin of his past and created something beautiful that is being used for God's glory. And Kirk Samuels has begun a ministry to men around the sin of his past, in which he's saying, let me help you out of the sin I was once locked in. Let me help get you free as God has set me free. And he calls it free indeed. And it keeps men from falling into the sin of pornography. And once they're in it, he helps them get out. And so, men, just a side commercial here. His next 6-week class is starting in July. I would encourage you to look into that, whether that's something that you're dealing with now or you just know is kind of something that you want to be girded against. Take your teenage sons, because this is a scourge on our culture, and get free from it if you need to. But the point of all these stories, all these examples, is God doesn't give up on us when we blow it. I mean, there's nothing that you can do to put you out of his reach. There's no list so long, so bad, so great that God's grace doesn't reach lower and meet us where we are and pick us up. And he doesn't just forgive us. He doesn't just love us. He doesn't just promise us heaven. He transforms us. His grace takes the sin of our past and turns it into something beautiful that he could use in his kingdom. He looks at you and he sees every mistake that you've made, stuff you don't even know that you've done, stuff that you've thought, stuff that you should have done that you didn't do. And whether you feel shame or regret over it or not, he looks at you and says, just give it to me. Give it to me and let me work with it. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. I would just like to end by personalizing this, by saying his grace is sufficient for me. His power is made perfect in my weakness. Would you just say that with me? His grace is sufficient for me, for his power is made perfect in my weakness. Just let that settle in. Let's just say that again. Think about, what is your weakness? What is your past? What are you shameful over? What is that thing that constantly is derailing you? Let's say it again. His grace is sufficient for me, for his power is made perfect in my weakness.